The day Marcel Vos died, the sun was shining so brightly it felt cruel. It poured gold over the cemetery grass, glimmered on the polished coffin, and touched every tear on my face like heaven was trying to make something beautiful out of the worst moment of my life. I stood there with my fists clenched, unable to accept that the man who had once pulled me out of a burning truck, laughed with me through broke winters, and called me brother without sharing my blood, was being lowered into the earth while the world kept moving as if nothing sacred had been taken. Before we go deeper into this story, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet promises that can change a life, please like this video, comment your thoughts, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Ancient Truth. For 1 year after Marcel's death, I lived like a man walking through fog. My name is Oren, and before losing him, I thought grief was something people survived by crying enough times. I was wrong. Grief was in the empty passenger seat of my old pickup. It was in the fishing rods we never used again, leaning in the corner of my garage like witnesses. It was in the cafe booth where I still ordered 2 coffees by mistake. Marcel and I had grown up in the same forgotten neighborhood, 2 boys with scraped knees and big dreams, both raised by fathers who believed tenderness was weakness. He became the brave one, the one who walked into storms smiling. I became the careful one, the one who counted risks and always expected loss. Yet somehow, he chose me as his closest friend. His widow, Soraya, disappeared from town 3 weeks after the funeral. No one blamed her. Their little house at the edge of Briar County had become a museum of pain. Every porch board remembered his boots. Every window held his reflection. People said she went to stay with relatives near the coast. I never called. Not because I did not care, but because I cared too much and had no idea what to say. What comfort could I offer the woman who had lost the better half of her heartbeat? So I let silence grow between us, thick and thorny, while I buried myself in work at the repair shop and pretended engines were easier to fix than hearts. Then, exactly 1 year after Marcel was buried, Soraya appeared at my door just after sunrise. It was a bright morning, one of those clear daytime mornings when the whole sky looks washed clean. I had just opened the garage doors when her car rolled into the driveway, dusty from a long drive. She stepped out slowly, wearing a pale blue dress and carrying a brown leather envelope against her chest. She looked thinner than I remembered, but not broken. Her eyes had changed. They had the tired brightness of someone who had cried until tears became useless and then learned how to stand anyway. When she saw me, she did not smile. She simply said she needed to tell me what Marcel had asked of her. Those words struck me harder than any storm. For a moment I could not move. The whole world seemed to narrow to her hands around that envelope. I invited her inside, though my house was a mess of unopened mail, cold coffee cups, and memories I had been too afraid to touch. She sat at my kitchen table where Marcel had once beaten me at cards and bragged about Soraya's cinnamon bread. Sunlight fell across her face as she opened the envelope and pulled out a folded letter with my name written across it in Marcel's crooked handwriting. I did not take it at first. My hands trembled like I was being asked to hold fire. Soraya told me Marcel wrote it during his last week in the hospital, when the doctors had stopped speaking in hopeful sentences. He had made her promise not to give it to me until a full year had passed. He said I would need to lose him before I could hear him. That sounded exactly like Marcel, always believing pain could teach what comfort could not. When I finally unfolded the letter, the room blurred. It began with a joke, because of course it did. He wrote that if I was crying, I should at least pretend it was dust. Then the words turned softer. He told me he knew I would blame myself. He knew I would replay the night of the accident, wondering if I could have reached him sooner, driven faster, argued harder with fate. He told me to stop. He said friendship was not measured by the final minute, but by every ordinary day we had shown up for each other before it. Then came the part that broke me open. He asked me to help Soraya finish the one dream he had been too sick to complete. Behind their house, beyond the old cedar fence, Marcell had started building a small daytime community garden and food shed for struggling families. He had not told many people because he did not want praise. He wanted a place where children could pick tomatoes after school, where lonely elders could sit in the sun, where people too proud to ask for charity could take fresh food without shame. He had bought seeds, lumber, tools, and even drawn plans in a notebook. Then illness took his strength, and after he died, Soraya could not bear to look at the unfinished garden. For a year, weeds had swallowed it. Marcell's request was simple and impossible. He wanted me to help her bring it back to life. I wanted to say yes immediately. I wanted to be the kind of friend who rose nobly from grief and honored the dead with steady hands. But the truth is, I felt anger first. I was angry that Marcell had left me another goodbye hidden inside a task. Angry that he still knew me well enough to give me purpose when I had been trying to disappear. Angry that Soraya had waited a year, while I drowned in guilt alone. I looked at her across the table and saw that she was afraid too. Not afraid of the garden, maybe, but afraid I would refuse the last thing her husband had asked. We drove to her house that afternoon. It sat beneath a wide, merciless noon sun, white paint peeling, porch swing still. Behind it, the garden looked like a battlefield after nature had won. Tall weeds bent over broken planters. Rust stained the unfinished shed frame. A cracked wheelbarrow lay on its side. The little wooden sign Marcell had carved was half buried in dirt, but I could still read the words, "Daylight Table." I remembered him telling me once that daytime had a mercy night did not, because in daylight people could see they were not alone. For weeks, Soraya and I worked there in silence. We pulled weeds until our fingers blistered. We replaced rotten boards. We carried soil beneath the hot afternoon sun while sweat soaked our shirts and old grief rose like dust. Some days she cried without sound. Some days I found myself talking to Marcell under my breath, cursing him for leaving, thanking him for knowing, begging him to explain why the world takes the generous ones first. Soraya never interrupted. She understood that grief has many languages, and not all of them are gentle. Slowly, people began to notice. A retired teacher named Isolde brought jars of lemonade. A teenage boy named Rennick, who had been caught stealing bread from the market, came by to help after school and discovered he was good with tools. Mrs. Caldera from 2 streets over donated old flower pots and stayed to plant basil. The garden became less of a memorial and more of a heartbeat. Every morning, sunlight touched something new, green shoots, fresh paint, open hands. But healing is not a straight road. One afternoon, while repairing the shed roof, I found Marcell's old work gloves tucked behind a beam. They were stiff with age, shaped by his hands. The sight of them hit me so suddenly I climbed down, walked behind the house, and broke apart where no one could see. Soraya found me sitting in the dirt, holding those gloves like they were a body. She sat beside me without saying anything for a long time. Then she told me Marcell had been afraid at the end, not of dying, but of being forgotten as a man who had lived fully. He wanted us to build Daylight Table not because he needed a monument, but because he believed love should keep moving after the person is gone. That changed something in me. Until then, I had been building for Marcell. After that day, I began building with him. The opening of Daylight Table happened on a Saturday morning under a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. There were no speeches at first, just people arriving with baskets, tools, children, folding chairs, and nervous smiles. Soraya placed Marcell's carved sign at the entrance, now cleaned and polished. We had rows of vegetables, a small pantry shed, a shaded bench, and a wooden table long enough for strangers to sit together. I watched Rennick hand a bag of cucumbers to an elderly man who tried to pay, only to be told everything there was given freely. I watched a little girl bite into a cherry tomato and laugh like she had discovered summer itself. I watched Soraya stand in the sunlight, one hand on the sign, her wedding ring catching the day. Near the end of the gathering, she handed me one final page from the envelope. Marcell had written it for both of us. He said that grief would try to turn love into a locked room, but we had to make it a doorway. He said the people who leave us do not ask us to stop living as proof that we love them. They ask us to live wider, kinder, braver. He asked Soraya to forgive herself for smiling again one day. He asked me to forgive myself for surviving him. And then he wrote that if daylight table ever opened, he wanted us to sit there at noon, eat bread, and let the sun find us. So we did. Soraya, Rennick, Isolde, Mrs. Caldera, half the neighborhood, and I sat at that long wooden table while daylight spilled over everything. There was bread, soup, fruit, and laughter that trembled at the edges because everyone knew tears were nearby. For the first time in a year, I did not feel like Marcell was buried only in the cemetery. I felt him in the shade we built, in the hands that gave, in the hungry people fed without shame, in the widow who had carried his promise through her own pain, and in the friend who finally understood that loyalty does not end at a grave. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who misses a loved one, comment your feelings, and subscribe to Ancient Truth so more stories of kindness and healing can reach the people who need them. Special request, please comment daylight table if you believe love can continue through the good we do for others. By evening, after everyone had gone, Soraya and I stood at the garden gate. The sun was lowering, but the day had not lost its warmth. She told me she had dreaded bringing me the letter because she feared it would reopen my wounds. I told her it had, but maybe some wounds need air before they can heal. We did not pretend everything was fixed. We did not claim grief had vanished. But as the garden rustled softly behind us, I realized something Marcell had known all along. Sometimes the dead leave us instructions not to burden us, but to guide us back to the living. And sometimes, 1 year after goodbye, a widow arrives at your door carrying not just a letter, but the beginning of your second chance.